Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the year 1601, Ireland was an open rebellion against England, and war had ravaged the island for nearly a decade. The English crown, determined to stamp out resistance once and for all, had poured men, money, and firepower into the conflict. The Irish, under the command of Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell, had fought bitterly, striking from the forests and the hills, refusing to submit. But the war had reached a critical moment. A Spanish force had landed on Ireland's southern coast, an army sent by King Philip III to open a second front against England and aid the Irish rebels. It was the first and only time that Catholic Europe attempted to intervene militarily in Ireland's struggle. If the Irish and Spanish had succeeded, the balance of power in Western Europe would have shifted dramatically. If they failed, Ireland would fall under English control, permanently altering the course of history. This battle was simply not just about Ireland. Its consequences rippled outward, shaping the British Empire, the Catholic world, and the future of warfare. England's victory here cemented its hold over Ireland, setting the stage for brutal colonization, land confiscations, and centuries of resistance. It created the conditions that forced generations of Irishmen into exile, some into Spanish and French armies, and others to the Americas, where their sons would fight again, this time against English rule in a new world. The political and military lessons learned here were carried forward by England, influencing its tactics in the Scottish Highlands, in India, and in its suppression of colonial uprisings across the globe. This was a moment of total war. No quarter had been given, no neutrality had been tolerated. A single misstep, a moment of hesitation, had decided whether Ireland remained free or was crushed under the weight of an empire. This was where Ireland's fate had been sealed. Let's now experience the Siege of Kinsale.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 10, The Siege of Kinsale, the 2nd of October 1601 to the 3rd of January 1602. English forces, 1,800 infantry and 600 cavalry. Spanish forces, between 3,300 to 3,400 infantry. Irish forces, roughly 6,000 men. The English victory crushed Ireland's last real chance at freedom, locking the island under English rule, its warriors dead, its leaders in flight, and its people left to endure centuries of occupation. But the Irish who escaped carried their hatred of the British across the Atlantic, and when revolution came to America, they stood at the front lines, ready to strike back.
The conflict between England and Ireland is older than written history itself. Legends whisper of bloodshed before the first chronicles were even carved into stone. But in recorded history, it truly began in the 12th century. The Normans, battle-hardened conquerors who had already bent England to their will, set their sights on Ireland. The descendants of William the Conqueror had no intention of letting the neighboring island remain untamed. For centuries, Ireland was little more than a wayward dominion, nominally under English control, but never fully subdued. That all changed in 1541 when Henry VIII, a man who brooked no defiance, declared himself King of Ireland. No longer content with a vassalage, he demanded submission. Over the next 50 years, the English pushed harder, trying to stamp their authority onto a land they saw as both untamed and dangerous. They viewed the Irish with contempt, yet also with a deep, gnawing unease, because despite their best efforts, they could never fully break them. English rule barely extended beyond a fortified strip of land along the eastern coast, known as Pale. Beyond that boundary lay a land they did not understand and could not control. It was wild, defiant, and in their eyes, barbaric. In the 1570s, the English finally pushed beyond their safehold on the coast, carving deeper into the Irish countryside. But the land did not welcome them, and neither did its people. The Earl of Essex led the assault on Ulster, and his version of pacification was merciless. But the Irish were not yet broken. By the 1590s, resistance hardened into something more than scattered defiance. Now they had leadership, strategy, and a cause worth dying for. At the heart of this defiance stood Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, the man who would lead Ireland's greatest stand against the English war machine. He was no stranger to English ways. Raised among them, trained by them, even fighting in their ranks, O'Neill knew his enemy better than most of his countrymen. But blood runs deeper than upbringing, and when the time came, he turned against his English masters. In 1585, he took his rightful place as the Earl of Tyrone, outwardly loyal to Queen Elizabeth's government, but that loyalty was a mask. By 1595, he cast it aside, unleashing a ruthless guerrilla war against English forces. Then, in 1598, he delivered them a humiliating defeat at Yellow Ford. England called him a traitor. His people called him a hero. He was not alone. By his side stood Red Hugh O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, a man as fierce as the stormy western coast he ruled. O'Neill had warriors hardened by years of bloodshed, but molding them into a disciplined force using European battle tactics was another matter. They were fierce, they were relentless, but they were not drilled soldiers. Yet O'Neill had an advantage. The English knew little of Ireland beyond the Pale. They did not understand its terrain, its people, or the way war was waged in its hills and its forests. A conventional army might falter, but a fast-moving guerrilla force could bleed them dry. But England had resources Ireland could not match: money, men, and weapons. When Queen Elizabeth sent a new Lord Deputy to crush the rebellion, O'Neill knew that to stand a chance, he needed allies. And who else could he turn to but Spain? Spain had not forgotten its humiliation at the hands of England in 1588 when the Armada was shattered. Helping the Irish would be sweet revenge and a way to strike another blow for Catholic Europe against the growing power of Protestant England. King Philip III had more than just Ireland on his mind. His armies were bogged down in the Netherlands, struggling to crush a Protestant uprising aided by English support. If he could force Elizabeth to divert troops to Ireland, he might turn the tide in his favor. O'Neill's envoys in Spain did their job well. King Philip agreed to send troops, but how many? And where would they land? On these crucial details, the Irish and the Spanish were not in complete accord. If the Spanish could send more than 6,000 men fully equipped with a siege train, an assault on Munster could trap the English between two formidable armies, one in the north and one in the south. It would be a campaign of total annihilation. But if the force was smaller, O'Neill argued, it would be madness to land them in the south, cut off from his army. Better to bring them to Ulster, where he could reinforce them with his own warriors and strike with a full force. But his warnings came too late. The Spanish fleet had already set sail. From Lisbon, a fleet cut through the waves, carrying 4,432 Spanish and Italian soldiers, far fewer than O'Neill had hoped for, but still a force capable of turning the tide. At their head stood Don Juan del Aguila, a seasoned warrior, but his men, many were fresh recruits, untested in battle, marching toward a war they barely understood. Command of the fleet lay with Don Diego Bochero, a man who answered only to the Spanish crown. He and Aguila did not see eye to eye. The general's brutal leadership style bred friction, and cooperation between them was strained from the very start. In mid-September, they set out. By October 2nd, the southern coast of Ireland rose into view. The landing was near, but so was danger. The Atlantic had already taken its toll. A storm scattered the fleet, and when they finally reached the port of Kinsale, just south of Cork, not all the ships had made it. When Aguila finally stepped onto Irish soil, he had barely 3,300 men at his back. And the worst of it, one of the missing ships carried the most experienced soldiers, and much of the precious gunpowder they so desperately needed. Bochero, perhaps in an effort to make amends, offered Aguila as many of his ship's cannons as he wanted. But what good were cannons without powder? Aguila took only 4, saving what little gunpowder remained for his aquabuses. The English did not hesitate. They let the Kinsale garrison withdraw, but only so they could carry a message, a warning to the English Lord Deputy. That message reached the man who would decide Ireland's fate, Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. He had come to Ireland in 1600 with a singular mission: to break the rebellion once and for all. Mountjoy had fortified the Pale, strengthening English outposts, but when news of the Spanish landing reached him, he stripped those defenses of men. Kinsale was now the priority. By October the 8th, he reached Cork. By the 27th, he had gathered 6,800 foot soldiers and over 600 cavalry, with word from London that reinforcements would follow. The full weight of England was bearing down on Kinsale. O'Neill wasted no time. He unleashed a series of raids out of Ulster, striking at English positions, rallying his allies, and trying to force Mountjoy to turn north. But Mountjoy did not flinch. His eyes remained locked on Kinsale. When word reached O'Neill that the English had thrown a siege around Kinsale, he knew there was no choice. He marched south, 3,000 infantry, 400 cavalry. If the English wanted a battle, they would have one. Red Hugh O'Donnell followed soon after with 2,000 infantry and 300 cavalry, ready to meet death before surrender. On October the 26th, Mountjoy planted his banner 5 miles from Kinsale, and the siege had begun. He did not need to fully encircle the town. He took the high ground, locked the Spanish in place, and rained cannon fire down upon them. His cavalry roamed unchecked, burning fields, slaughtering livestock, and ensuring that not a single scrap of food would reach the defenders. The war was not just of steel, but also of words. Mountjoy declared that Ireland must submit to English rule and reject foreign meddling. Aguila, in turn, called on every Catholic in Ireland to rise against the English oppressors, even invoking the Pope's wrath, though he had no real authority to do so. O'Neill knew leaving Ulster was a gamble. Many had warned against it, but he ignored them. By the end of October, his army was marching south. The risk was enormous. Ulster, his stronghold, would be left vulnerable. His men, barely trained in European warfare, would have to cross an entire island carrying only what they could on their backs. And when they arrived, they would find a land already ruined, stripped bare by Mountjoy's cavalry, winter pressing down upon them. No shelter but the sky above. Reinforcements for the Spanish were uncertain. For Mountjoy, they were guaranteed. And even if the Irish and Spanish could join forces, there was no telling whether they could truly fight as one. November came, and with it, Mountjoy's first hammer blows. He struck hard at the Spanish outposts, forcing them to retreat and killing what little livestock Aguila had left. His cannons never stopped. Aguila tried to break out, tried to silence the guns, but every attempt was beaten back. On November 11th, an outer fort crumbled, and the English took it. Mountjoy had spies. He knew O'Donnell was closing in. He sent his lieutenant, Sir George Carew, to cut him off, but Red Hugh slipped through his fingers. When Carew returned to Kinsale, he didn't come empty-handed. The Earl of Thomond had raised fresh troops, 1,000 infantry and 100 cavalry. The English siege lines now grew stronger. But O'Neill and O'Donnell struck where it hurt most. They cut the English supply line to Dublin. Food ran low, and the skies turned black. December brought rain, mud, and misery to the English ranks. As the year closed, a flicker of hope arrived. 400 Spanish soldiers landing at Castlehaven marched in to reinforce the Irish. But they brought more than men, they brought urgency. Break through Mountjoy's lines, they told O'Neill. Link up with Aguila before it's too late. O'Neill was cautious. Mountjoy's position looked weak, but was it a trap? O'Donnell, always bold, argued for action, and the Spaniards agreed. Historians still debate what happened next. Were the Spanish and Irish truly coordinated? Did Aguila even know when the attack was coming? Or was miscommunication their downfall? And so January 3rd, 1602 was the day Ireland's fate was decided. The Irish army split into 3 columns, each with its own mission, each marching toward destiny. Leading the charge was Richard Tyrrell, a man of English blood but Irish heart, once loyal to Elizabeth and now her sworn enemy. He led 1,000 Irish warriors backed by 200 Spaniards into the fight. O'Neill commanded the main force, 3,000 men strong. O'Donnell followed with the rearguard, 2,000 more. Under cover of darkness, they marched 6 miles through bitter cold, through sodden fields, through exhaustion. But something went wrong. Whether it was poor coordination, a lack of discipline, or commanders at odds, they failed to reach their positions before dawn. Mountjoy, though, was no fool. His scouts had been watching, listening, and waiting. The moment O'Neill's men moved, he knew, and he was ready. Mountjoy moved with precision. 5 regiments held the siege lines. 4 more secured Kinsale. The rest, 1,500 to 2,000 infantry and up to 500 cavalry, he led personally. He took the high ground, securing a ridge over Millwater Ford. He'd meet the Irish head-on. O'Neill's men reached the ridge and saw the English waiting for them. He didn't rush into battle. He waited, eyes scanning the distance, hoping to see Aguilar's troops pouring out of Kinsale to hit the English from behind. But the Spanish didn't come. No signal, no movement. O'Neill now had to act alone. He began pulling his men back, drawing them through the marshy ground near the ford, hoping to lure the English cavalry into terrain that would slow them down. He was playing for time. O'Donnell was still on the move. Tyrrell's men had yet to fully deploy. The battle was forming, but it was forming too slowly. O'Neill tried to form his men into a tercio, a dense, disciplined square of spears and muskets, the strongest defense of the age. But Mountjoy saw his chance. Before the Irish could fully organize, he unleashed his cavalry. Sir Richard Wingfield led the charge. Wingfield's horsemen crashed through the Irish skirmishers, cutting them down like weeds. But then they met Irish cavalry head-on, and the charge faltered. The Irish horsemen struck back, sending the English reeling. But Wingfield was only the first wave. Behind him thundered 2 more cavalry units, one led by Mountjoy himself, and the other by Captain Power. They hit the Irish lines like a hammer, smashing through their poorly trained horsemen, and the Irish cavalry broke. They turned and they ran, straight through O'Neill's infantry, turning discipline into chaos. The collapse was then swift. The Irish lines crumbled. The English cavalry cut them down as they ran, while infantry advanced, pressing the slaughter. Tyrrell saw the disaster unfolding, so he turned his men, tried to cut a path between O'Neill's broken forces and the advancing English horse. But before he could strike, his own flank came under attack. O'Donnell, brave, reckless, unyielding, tried to rally his men. But as they watched the rout unfold, they hesitated. Then they turned, and they marched away. And in Kinsale, Aguilar listened, the echoes of gunfire, the distant cries of battle. But he did nothing. He thought it was a trick, a trap, set to lure him from the walls. Then, hearing the English victory shots, he mistook them for an Irish advance. He ordered his men to march, but as they emerged, he saw the truth. The banners were English. He pulled his men back in disgrace. Mountjoy had barely lost a dozen men. The Irish had lost everything. The fields ran red with Irish blood, 1,200 dead. The Spanish suffered too, but only lightly. 90 men lost for the Spanish. With the Irish army shattered, Mountjoy turned back to Kinsale. The bombardment resumed. The walls, already scarred and broken from weeks of English fire, wouldn't hold much longer. And then 3 days of talks. No more bargaining, no more war. On January 12th, Aguilar surrendered. The Spanish were spared. They were given ships, supplies, and safe passage home. Ireland, however, was not so lucky. O'Neill and O'Donnell fled back to Ulster. They fought on for another year, waging the only war they knew, hit and run, strike and vanish. But after Elizabeth died, O'Neill saw the writing on the wall, and he made peace. In the years following the battle, many Irish fighters, especially those of the Gaelic aristocracy, fled to Europe in what became known as the Flight of the Earls in 1607. These exiles found refuge in Spain, France, and Austria, serving in foreign armies, but others made their way to the Americas. By the 18th century, waves of Irish immigrants, many of whom were descendants of those exiles or later victims of English oppression, landed in the American colonies. These Irish, both Catholic and Protestant, carried a deep-seated hatred of British rule, forged in the fires of conquest and subjugation. It's no coincidence that so many Irishmen fought in the American Revolution. Among them were the Scots-Irish, Ulster Protestants, who had suffered under English rule and now turned their muskets against the same oppressor in a new land. Figures like Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Continental Congress, and John Stark, a hero of the Battle of Bennington, were of Irish descent. Nearly half of Washington's Continental Army had Irish roots. Their battle cry? Liberty or death. A sentiment that had echoed in Ireland for centuries. And so from the blood-soaked fields of Kinsale, Ireland fell under England's iron grip. Not for years, not for decades, but for centuries. The Irish who stayed would resist, and the Irish who fled would carry that fire across the sea. Finally, in December of 1920, the Government of Ireland Act was passed. But too late to undo the past. Too late to silence the hunger for freedom. Because when the hour came, when another rebellion was needed, the Irish were there, on the battlefields of a new world, striking back at the empire that had once crushed them. The revolution that made America, it had an Irish heartbeat.